Nathan Drake is back once again with his first PS5 adventure, bringing Chloe and friends along for an updated and upgraded dual package of Uncharted 4 and the spin-off in The Lost Legacy, offering enhancements and some huge performance leaps over the globe-trotting Thieves PS4 and Pro release. But is it a treasure worth fighting for? This new remastered release offers a few paths to play, with existing disc or digital owners of either games being able to upgrade for $10, euros or Great British pounds to this new pack, or a full new purchase if new to the Uncharted fold, with even PC players getting a release later this year, as we have seen with previous remasters in Ghost of Tsushima or Death Stranding. You can easily import your PS4 save using the main menu's inbuilt conversion tool, allowing you to pick up where you left off, just sharper and faster than before. Simply download or USB copy your save over to your PS5 drive, then fire it up and convert it to a PS5 format. You can copy multiple saves across, you simply need to do them one at a time from this main menu. The biggest upgrades are resolution and performance, with it offering 3 modes of play. Sadly, no multiplayer is included in this release, which is a shame as one mode really helps that. First of the trio of modes is Fidelity, offering a sharp and crisp 3840 by 2160 resolution at the same 30 FPS of the PS4 and Pro release, which ran at 1080 and 1440p respectively. This helps all related buffers within the image, alpha textures, shadows, screen space reflections and more. Next, and likely the most popular, is the performance mode, offering the same 2560 by 1440p resolution of the Pro by doubling frame rates to 60 by halving frame times to 16.67 milliseconds. The loss in pixel clarity from 4K is a minor but noticeable sacrifice, but the gain in temporal pixel counts and extra fluidity is a welcome one, specifically on controller input latency, which I'll get to later. Finally, we have the Performance Plus mode, again doubling frame rates over performance to 120 FPS, so long as you have a TV to support that. That cost again though is resolution, which now drops by 50% to 1080p, matching the base PS4 but running at 4 times the frame rate. This mode is clearly the one that looks the softest on a 4K screen, but the latency improvements are again noticeable even over the 60 FPS performance mode. No dynamic resolution appears to be in use, but the engine's TAA helps minimize noisy segments, and the motion blur shutter speed has been increased to compensate for the faster frame rates, which help improve clarity in motion on objects, textures, and more over the Pro and PS4.
Scheiße. Look at that. Holy hell. There's a massive relief carved into the side of that mountain. And you were worried we were going to turn that crank and die.
Now, all 3 modes are available in Uncharted 4 and The Lost Legacy and can be easily swapped in the menus with no delay, meaning you can pick your poison, pixel clarity or pixel frequency. With a game such as Uncharted, the increased controller refresh fluidity is beneficial, if not game-changing. What is a humongous improvement though is the cartridge-like loading times, or mostly lack thereof. Even on an SSD powered Pro, the load from a save unpacking into RAM can take over 36 seconds. On PS5, this is now over 10 times faster, with loads now taking approximately 3 seconds and effectively being removed. Menus simply fade out and the game just fades in. This shift to a native PS5 app enables the team to leverage the SSD speed, most integrally the memory subsystem configuration, all within the new SDK and relevant API calls. In addition, the game now has a smaller footprint on your disk drive due to that oodle texture compression and dedicated compression hardware built within the SoC, meaning both games are smaller than Uncharted 4 alone on the PS4.
Just how far we've come.
And the award for a incredibly minor update that would probably go unnoticed, these real-time cinematics blended into video here and then back again using these fades from one scene to the next, are now real-time because they render at the output resolution you choose in the menu. This means they've either benefited from their SSD infrastructure, allowing this to be rendered at once and then fading between the two, or they've re-rendered them as video files. I'm not sure, but it does show a good attention to detail that you probably would never even spot. What doesn't go unnoticed though is performance, and that's probably the biggest area of discussion. As you can see visually, it's very minor. Small updates, things like shadow maps and resolution on texture details and assets overall, all increase with resolution, but fundamentally all the effects, the visual settings and the output all match the PS4 Pro and then just scale with resolution up the stack. This gives you benefits across SSR, shadows, textures, but not much else. But performance is something very different, both in the screen output and the controller input latency. Starting with Uncharted 4 then, the PS4 Pro version both targeted 30 FPS, and in the majority of action held close to that to never be of an issue. One of the biggest and most frantic sections was the Raiders of the Lost Ark homage truck and jeep chase from that E3 2015 demo. It saw dips on base PS4 and Pro to almost identical levels, mostly into the next refresh cycle of 16 milliseconds, but this could see lows of 20 FPS crop up in brief segments of action. Largely fill rate and bandwidth limited, but occasionally you could also get longer stutters with context switching or pointing to CPU memory or other cache related delays. See here with a switch over to driving as the world simulation is warped back into line with the gameplay. As a 30 FPS game though, with such impressive visuals on the hardware, it was incredibly solid. It's no surprise to see that on PS5 in the native 4K 30 FPS mode it does not drop a stitch within the same stressful segments, keeping the frame time flatter than a bad guy's ECG after a run-in with Nate the serial killer. Overall performance in 30 FPS mode on both titles here as shown in the stressful section of Uncharted 4, and even some basic combat and exploration and jeep driving in the Lost Legacy, it doesn't appear to drop or skip a beat. Obviously this is much better than the base PS4, but it was never that bad to begin with, and really at 30 FPS you're getting a consistent performance across Fidelity mode on both games. Certainly on the PS5 the increased resolution and clarity is beneficial, but the improvements to performance is one that I think will be hard for many to skip out on. And that's where this performance 60 FPS mode really brings the A game. And that means it doesn't dip hardly at all in most of the action. Again, in these stressful sections you can see it somewhere into the mid 50s, but it's never very long and it's very brief. Majority of action here is a locked 60 FPS, aside those little skips on all versions, again like I mentioned around memory CPU allocations when it realigns the world. Everything is a perfect 60 FPS more often than not, which means you just get to enjoy the impact in terms of the action and those input latency improvements. It certainly is a big step up from the 30 FPS title, and it feels much better in such a fast action game as this, with this incredible section which is one of the highlights of the Uncharted 4 game itself. But what about that 120 FPS mode then? Well, again, it does an exceptional job in Uncharted 4 here to hold on to such a high refresh rate. Remember, this is running at 8 milliseconds. That's incredibly fast, even at 1080p, no matter what the hardware. But we do see some more often skips into that next refresh cycle of 8 milliseconds into 16. Again, some of those may be CPU related, because at this refresh rate you are becoming very bound by whatever your slowest point is, and that's likely to be a single CPU core. But overall the performance here is exceptional in Uncharted 4. Unsurprisingly, this PS5 port leaping up to 120 FPS does present some issues with animation cycles and physics at times running too fast and glitching, but they are minor and not game breaking from my experience. The extra fluidity from 120 FPS and even those minor dips aside at 8 milliseconds are hard to spot, and they're not that noticeable. In fact, you can see a good comparison here of what 120 FPS offers to the fluidity of movement and the smooth movement on screen. Obviously, we are capped at 60 FPS here on YouTube, so by slowing it down by 50%, you can see that judder improvement from the 30 FPS of the Pro to that 60 FPS performance mode of the PS5. That smooth motion is apparent here in slowing it down, and then it's the only way to show 120 FPS. You can again see that leap up in fluidity. It's due to the 8 millisecond refresh time rather than 16. So it does benefit the visual fluidity of the screen, and even though it's 1080p, because it's running at such a high refresh rate, again you get more pixels in the same time because it's rendering more frames. And that combination means you also get improvements in input latency, and they're quite significant. Naughty Dog had a high input latency time anyway because they staggered a lot of their jobs within the CPU and GPU across 3 frames on top of the engine input latencies. So here on the PS4 Pro we're seeing a median, that's the average, the most likely result you'll get, of 144 milliseconds across various movements, and it's around 4 to 8 milliseconds slower on the PS5 on average, so somewhere between 150-ish milliseconds. And that means you get improvements on input latency moving up the performance stack, which you can see on screen, showing you the benefits of 120 FPS mode. It's not just the fluidity on screen, which can be harder to spot for over 60, but the input time can definitely be felt, and that's where it would really benefit the multiplayer element. But it is a boost nonetheless, and one you can certainly feel in that excellent DualSense control here, which also includes adaptive triggers and haptic feedback in all those actions and elements of Uncharted, which obviously is a very high octane game anyway. The story is pretty much identical for the Lost Legacy, aside that 120 FPS mode. Again, you get much better performance than you do on the PS4 Pro by leaping up to 60 or 120. The Pro and the PS4 were very good in this title anyway, with it holding 30 FPS locked here with no real issues in these combat sections, and even driving around in the Jeep, no issues at all. I didn't spot any major drop. And that's equally true, unsurprisingly, of the PS5 Fidelity mode at 30 FPS, and that's the same as it was in Uncharted 4. When you go to 60 though, again you can see some judder areas and it certainly starts to drop frames, and the 120 FPS mode is where it really struggles at certain points. Again, there's lots of dense foliage here, lots of heavy alpha and overdraw, so that's really going to eat up the bandwidth of the system, and I think that's what we're seeing here with those little skips into 8 milliseconds. Again, like I mentioned, it's such a fast refresh cycle that it can be hard. As long as it stays within the 8 millisecond, jumping to 16, which obviously gives you 60 FPS, you don't really feel it. But it can drop as low as around the 90s in the driving through sections here with long vistas, fills the screen with alpha effects of the water, the splashes, the foliage. All of those areas can have some small judders and obviously streaming data in, so it doesn't perform as well as the tested sections of Uncharted 4. But again, a game like this that's quite open, wide linear, you are going to get a variety of CPU and GPU utilization and therefore stress, which means you can get a variety of performance issues. Overall, the 120 FPS mode performs very well, and most people would be happy with it because of the improvement to input latency. It doesn't perform as rock solid as the 60 FPS mode, and the Lost Legacy appears to perform slightly worse than Uncharted 4 in the same levels, but you're really only going to notice this when you're driving around wide areas and going into sector points where it seems to judder slightly more at that 120 FPS. That's the only time I noticed the dips outside of this frame graph. I would have never noticed these small 8 millisecond skips. Overall, the performance on both the 60 and 120 FPS mode is commendable. In terms of what it's pushing, how fast it is, and how much it dips, or how relatively little it dips, there is no real concerns. It certainly isn't a rock solid 120 FPS, but I've definitely seen far worse titles try to target this, so they've done an impeccable job in uplifting this to 120 FPS, specifically on the utilization here, with the amount of dynamic physics, collision, AI, and combat going on. I mean, the AI in this game does kind of annoy me a little bit. You do end up having characters running in front of you, so there is definitely areas they can improve in their next title, but it's still an impressive result on a performance perspective. And overall, I think many will be happy that they get that 30, 60 and 120 FPS modes at the flick of a switch. Uncharted 4 is the last crusade for Nate in more ways than one. Here it is refined, smoother, faster, sharper, but not to a level I'm sure many had hoped. The same with Lost Legacy. Unlike God of War on PC we covered a couple of weeks ago, we get no further bells and whistles over Pro. Improved textures and resolution are the only minor visual boosts, with a level of detail, ambient occlusion and all others remaining the same. This would still not transform the title, but I'm sure it would have enticed more to double dip. It remains to be seen what the PC release later this year will offer over this. It is a great update to those that prefer faster and cleaner images, but it's more aimed at those diving into either of these titles for the first time, or that cheaper £10 option for the hardcore who want the best performance on their PlayStation 5s. A refined and improved release for sure, which highlights just how far Naughty Dog were ahead of the pack, even in 2016. But for anything over performance, you may be left wanting a little more treasure. Anyway, that's it for another deep dive into the game technology, visuals and performance. And if you like what we do here on IGN, then please keep it IGN by subscribing and be back soon for more performance reviews. I'll catch you on the next one.
Okay, hop on! Sam, get in the goddamn car! I'm faster! Stop arguing! Watch out!